ask why I sing. I sing because I enjoy it. I sing because it's a beautiful day. I sing because I'm glad to be alive. I sing because I love trees, because doves and wrens do too. I sing to create harmony among all. Where I live, there is food. Because I sing because there is air and water are clean. I sing because you will get to know me in the morning, afternoon, and evening, and know why ancestors sang like me for eons. It is a family tradition. I must go now. The sun is setting, and I must be up at dawn to sing. Okay, so some announcements. So next week on the 30th, Karen Burns is opening her condo to us in downtown from 5:30 to 7:30. If you want to go, please RSVP to me, either text or email, and I will give you directions on how to enter the building, etc. If you remember, a few months ago, we had Doug Carter, the Indiana State Police Superintendent, and we asked him if we could go see one of his forensic labs, and he said yes. So we're working on that. There's one at 16th Street downtown, so we'll get that out on the date, and you'll have to RSVP because there's going to be 20 people at the max. And it'll be an hour and a half. And we're going to do this not at lunchtime, but probably later in the afternoon, so then you can head for home or go out for a beer or whatever afterwards. The next lunch bunch is the 19th of next month at Iozzo's. Let Roger know if you're interested. We had a social supper last night at Lavino's down on Mass Avenue. The food was fabulous. Sorry y'all missed it. There were five of us there, and it was super good. The next foundation board meeting is next month on the 21st. We are forming the allocations committee to compile and recommend club funding requests for the foundation board. Roger will be reaching out to chairs for our signature events and other things, so let him know if you're interested in assisting. And if you've got things that you would like funded, please let us know about that as well. Graham Honecker and Alex Carr, our own Graham Honecker, and Alex Carr have written a book called A Blessing, Not a Burden, and they will be speaking on the 22nd of next month, and that will be at the Columbia Club. Remember, if you haven't written all this down, go to indykiwanis.org, and all this information can be found there. So Mike Halstead and Jason Burke, I just read this on Facebook, and so we want to congratulate them for receiving the Indiana Landmarks 2024 Renaissance Award for their company's $9 million restoration of a historic building. It was a National Bank building in Marion, Indiana. It's now a mixed-use development known as the Ridley Tower. Next month is the 75th anniversary of the formation of the Kiwanis Foundation of Indianapolis. Woohoo, who knew? So we're going to, through support from the foundation, if you didn't know this, we sent 2 local key clubbers who weren't able to raise enough funds, so we helped them go to their international convention. Key Club of Indiana District Webmaster Haley Lavarne and Rose Division Lieutenant Governor Love Swayze, both from Perry Meridian High School. So they were able to go, and they said it was absolutely fabulous. And they took the stage to receive awards. So good for them. We'll hear from them in the coming months, just like we did from Shortridge Key Club a few weeks ago. And also, finally, we have our slate for nominations. The nominating committee has their slate, and we will begin serving you on October the 1st. I will continue as the club immediate past president. Eric Rowland will be the past president and foundation president. Eric Rowland will be the club president. Wendy Paddock is the club elect president. Greg Silver, Laura Holloway, and Chuck Cotterman have agreed to 3-year director terms. And Jackie Clancy, we want to thank her because her term is ending. Roger Cummings has agreed to serve as treasurer, and Kelly Olis is reappointed as secretary. If you're interested in serving as a director, please let me know. The slate and updated bylaws will be presented by email for vote sometime next month. All right, Trina, it is up to you now to introduce our fabulous speaker.
It is my honor and privilege to introduce Elizabeth Carr. She is a journalist, a podcast host, an event host, an on-air expert, and a keynote speaker who helps people and companies navigate the complex world of infertility as an industry insider. Fun fact is she was the first IVF baby in the US. In the media since she was 3 cells old. She is a passionate advocate for those fighting for fertility rights, from battles over insurance coverage to educating doctors on how to interact with patients going through fertility treatments, to advice for parents on how to talk to their children about assisted reproductive technologies. Elizabeth is proud to share her voice and story in order to fight for those who may not be able to fight for themselves. She is a fearless patient advocate.
How was your drive? Great.
Greg, do you mind muting? Elizabeth is a fearless patient advocate, striving to educate and empower people based on her life experience and her expertise within the fertility world. She is presented to audiences around the globe, including the United Nations, ASRM, ESHRE, and the National Infertility Association, Resolve. Her passion lies in education, from helping companies craft fertility benefit packages and parental leave policies, to keynote speaking, to sitting one-on-one with families facing fertility questions head-on. In March, she was invited to attend the State of the Union address given by President Biden following the suspension of the IVF services in Alabama. Elizabeth, thank you for taking time to be with us, and more so for the amazing work that you continue to do. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you all for having me. Thank you for the intro, Trina. It's so nice to see your face again. As Trina said, my name's Elizabeth, and I was the first IVF baby in the United States. IVF stands for in vitro fertilization. And while I'm sure many or most of you have heard about IVF, I always assume that, you know, there are many levels of education here. So I'm just going to do a 1 second. What is IVF? IVF is when a sperm and an egg are fertilized in a petri dish. And once fertilization occurs, then the now embryo is placed back into the woman's womb. And 9 months later, you know, I was born just like everybody else. So it sounds a lot more complicated in the media than that, but that's really the sentence that I've been explaining people how I was born since I was very little. I am 42 years old, and I'm coming to you today on actually World IVF Day. So today marks the birth of the first IVF baby in the world, who is a good friend of mine, Louise Brown, who was born in 1978 in England. So I want to explain a little bit, kind of give you a little backstory of how I got here, as well as where I think we're headed. So in 1978, my dear friend Louise was born in England, and she was born by what we call natural cycle, which meant there was no hormone protocol. Like normally when you go through IVF, you have to give a lot of shots, and there's a lot of hormones that are given to the woman to like produce enough eggs to retrieve, to make this whole process possible. Louise's mother wasn't given any of those drugs. She was just, you know, had to follow along with her natural, you know, cycle of being a woman. So that's how Louise was born. Fast forward, my two doctors, Doctors Howard and Georgiana Jones, were in their 60s, and they were doctors at Johns Hopkins Medical in Baltimore, Maryland. And they reached age 65. And at the time, Hopkins had a policy that when you reached age 65, that you had to have mandatory retirement. And so in their retirement, they decided that they would go join their buddy, Dr. Mason Andrews, who was a colleague of theirs previously at Hopkins. down in Norfolk, Virginia. And Mason said to them, come to Virginia. You can sail on the Chesapeake Bay. I know you all are big sailors. You like to do that kind of thing. Come to Virginia, and why don't you come and work at this little tiny independent, privately funded medical school called Eastern Virginia Medical School. So Howard and Georgiana, my two doctors, decided to go down to the medical school. And on the very day, July 25th, that they were moving into their new home in Chesapeake, Virginia, there was a knock at the door. And it was a reporter. And the reporter said, Doctors Jones, today, I'd like your comment because the first IVF baby in the world was born, and I know you all have been working on looking at IVF and studying it. I would like your reaction to this news. And my Dr. Howard, who was kind of the orator of the group, thought it was a really flip question that the reporter asked. And she asked him, well, what do you think it would take to have an IVF program here in Norfolk? And like any good surgeon, he said, well, it would just take some money because the clinic was privately funded. Fast forward the next day, the story shows up in the newspaper, the Norfolk Virginian Pilot, and Howard and Georgiana's phone rings. And it's a former patient of Dr. Georgiana, who was actually the endocrinologist. She was really the brains of the husband-wife operation team. And the woman on the other end of the phone says, well, Dr. Georgiana, I understand that you all could start a IVF clinical program here in Norfolk if you just had a little money. And I happen to have a family trust. And so I'd like to know how much exactly you need. And she donated enough money for them to get the clinical program started in Norfolk in 1978. Fast forward, my parents are in Massachusetts. I live in Massachusetts. I grew up in Massachusetts. And my parents got married quite young, and my parents immediately started trying to have children. And found out very quickly my mother could get pregnant, but not stay pregnant. And her doctor finally figured out the reason she was having a problem was a botched appendix surgery when she was 18 left her with a lot of scar tissue around her fallopian tubes. And so she had 3 what we call ectopic pregnancies, which are basically tubal pregnancies, which caused her fallopian tubes to burst. And she nearly died from the internal bleeding 3 times. And so her doctor, her OBGYN, said, we actually need to remove your fallopian tubes. And by the way, that probably means you will not have children of your own because fallopian tubes are kind of a critical piece of the equipment. So as she's recovering from the surgery that removed her fallopian tubes, her OBGYN comes in to check in on her. And he says, by the way, I just went to a conference where I learned about this procedure where they've had success in England called IVF. And it looks like there's a husband-wife team down in Norfolk, Virginia, trying to get a program off the ground. And I don't know anything about it, but maybe you want to look into it. And she applied, and Dr. Howard and Georgiana called the next day and said, when can you get here? So my mother was admitted to this experimental program with 10 other couples. They weren't sure who was going to be successful or not. Everybody had a different protocol because this has never been done before in the US. And in December of 1981, I was born the first IVF baby through what we call modern IVF, which is all the shots and all the hormones and everything that you hear about everybody going through now. So I share all of that because, you know, it strikes me that all of these dominoes had to fall into exact place and order in order for me to get here, and that it was no small feat. Now, I mentioned this clinic was in Virginia. Meanwhile, my parents are, you know, in Massachusetts. So how that relates to today's landscape is, you know, at the time, nobody was covering IVF through insurance. And so my parents were paying entirely out of pocket for not only the procedure, but all the hospital stays, all the hormones, all the drugs. She had a special drug called Pergonal, which was actually flown in from Switzerland. And so not inexpensive, as you can imagine. On top of that, there were no outpatient procedures for IVF at that time because it had never been done. So they were flying from Massachusetts down to Virginia for every single treatment, every blood draw, everything. And it wasn't until I think 3 years after I was born that Massachusetts actually became the first state in the country to mandate insurance coverage for IVF, which means if you are an insurance carrier in the state of Massachusetts, you are required by a state law to cover IVF and reproductive technologies. But the irony, of course, here is that IVF, when I was born in Virginia, was actually illegal and banned in the state of Massachusetts. Now, and then they became the first state to offer insurance coverage. And ironically, the state of Virginia, where I was actually born, there is still not an insurance mandate in the state of Virginia. So I mention that because I wanted to fast forward. I've been talking about these issues probably since as young as I could string a sentence together, because I was in the media all the time talking about these issues. And so a lot of what I focus on now is doing advocacy work and trying to get insurance coverage for across all these states. So the irony, of course, is that, you know, there is no mandate in Virginia still. And I'm very actively involved in trying to make that happen because, you know, 42 years ago, they were pioneers allowing me to be born, and we still don't have coverage there. So I'm very, very focused still on educating people about not only the technology in general, but all reproductive options that people have to build their family. And when people think about IVF, you know, when it first started, it was a tool to overcome infertility, right? Like my mother had this problem with her fallopian tubes and needed IVF. Now, IVF is used by so many more people to create their family. It's used for if you're going through cancer treatments, but you know you want to have a family, you can have your eggs frozen. And then after you're done cancer treatments, you can go through IVF to create your family. If you are an LGBTQ couple who wants to build their family, you can use IVF. If you have genetic conditions that are terrible in your family history that you want to try and reduce the risk of passing them along, you can go through IVF. So now, you know, back then there were a handful of us IVF babies, and Louise and I are dear, dear friends. But now there are 12 million of us on the planet, which is wonderful, but also makes me feel very old all at the same time. So I just wanted to mention that because I think even in groups like this, you know, even if you know nothing about IVF, but you know that it's available, right? That at least can shed light to somebody else who's trying to figure out how they're going to build their family when they're dealing with all these kinds of issues. So it's kind of been my life's mission to educate on all the different options that are out there, because I feel very strongly that the worst time to make a decision about how to build your family is when you're facing a crisis. And often an infertility diagnosis feels like a moment of crisis. And so the worst time to make a decision is in a moment of crisis. So if you at least have a baseline, you know, set of knowledge of saying like, oh, well, I think there are options for me. It's not a dead end road here. You know, it makes the journey feel a lot less lonely. So anyway, I don't want to like take up all this time. I'd rather open it up and have you ask me whatever questions. And there are no stupid questions, and I'll share why. The worst question I've ever been asked was actually by a reporter, which, side note, I was a reporter for 15 years, so it really kind of upset me they didn't do their homework. She asked me, do I have a belly button? And the spoiler alert answer is yes, I do. So now I have now asked the stupidest question I've ever been asked. You can ask me anything else.
Yeah, I guess that would be the highlight, wouldn't it? So we want to thank you because I think this is the first time we've ever had someone who's been on the cover of Life magazine come to one of our meetings. So we feel pretty privileged that you're with us today. I got a couple questions. One is when Massachusetts, since they were against it and made it coverage a state regulation, were your parents part of that push to make that happen? How involved were they?
Yes, my parents were extremely involved in testifying in front of the state committee that was deciding all of this. And actually, you may not be aware of this, but Resolve, which is the National Infertility Awareness Association, actually started in 1974, even before Louise Brown was born. And it started in Massachusetts around a kitchen table. So between Resolve being started in Massachusetts and my parents really pushing quite hard for coverage of all these kinds of things and allowing, a clinic to even exist in Massachusetts, which now we have, world renowned clinics here in Massachusetts, like Boston IVF and other places. So they were heavily involved. And I think that kind of obviously plays a part in the fact that, I've been an advocate for all these things. Oh my goodness, that is the funniest photo of my parents.
We find ways to embarrass our guests.
Yeah, that's the funny photo because that was actually at my first press conference, which another fun fact was I was 3 days old when I had my first press conference, and the nurse, I had so much hair. I came out with so much hair that the nurse actually put Jerry curl in my hair, and that's why you can see it kind of sticking up.
My next question is, so Massachusetts was against it, and a lot of the states were too. What was their pushback? Was it insurance cost? Was it religion? Was it ethics? Or was it something else?
Yeah, so when I was born, I'll tell a funny story because I think it kind of encompasses the whole journey. So before I was born, a columnist named Ellen Goodman wrote a column, an op-ed in the Boston Globe, which I later came to work for. We'll talk more about that in a minute. And basically she said, if we allow IVF, there's going to be this whole army of, clone babies and designer children and all these things. And won't it be awful? And none of them will be normal and yada, yada. Because everybody was scared. This technology had never been done before. So people were scared. They didn't know what to expect. So basically, the thing that changed their minds is I came out looking and sounding like everybody else, and I've been studied my entire life. Spoiler, I'm totally just like everybody else and don't have any special powers whatsoever. But they measured my brain waves. I went through psychological tests. I was put through all the health rigmarole. So that was really the thing that changed their minds. And it was kind of the same thing in England with Louise. The English government was very against IVF until there was a successful birth and she came out normal. So that's kind of what turned the tides in the US as well.
So someone put in the comments that they know quadruplet IVF kids. So how prevalent is it to have multiples with IVF?
So this is a great question. When I was born, the technology, as you can imagine, was only so good. Actually, the ultrasound technology even back then was so bad that they weren't sure if I was going to be a boy or a girl because they couldn't really tell. But so there was only, they retrieved 2 eggs from my mother. One didn't look so good. And there was only 1 egg left, and here I am, right? So originally, they would only put back like 1 egg. Then we had this kind of surge where in the 90s, people wanted to try and optimize their chances of getting pregnant, because even when you put 1 egg back in, no matter how great that egg is, sometimes, nature just does its thing and decides like, nah, we don't want, this is not going to happen. Right. We can't control for that. So women started saying like, put 4 eggs back, put 8 eggs back. And then when we had a situation where 8 eggs were put back, and there was actually live births from that situation. Everybody might remember the term octomom. The industry itself course corrected and said, no, that we don't want that to happen. That's very unsafe for the mother. We are going to go back to putting in what we call singletons, which is one embryo. So now your chances of having multiples in IVF are just the same as if you were naturally getting pregnant, because it's still just one embryo that's being put back. The days of putting back 3, 4, 5, 7, 8 are gone. That is basically malpractice in these days. Yeah.
Interesting. Other questions for our guest?
Can you talk a little about what may have changed socially, politically over the last few years? I feel like the pendulum has swung, where some states are talking about banning IVF. What sparked that, and is it founded?
Yeah, so I'll put it to you this way. The arguments that this country are having right now over what should be done with reproductive technologies and eggs and embryos and how to create families are the same arguments and debates that were happening 42 years ago. It's just that now we have things like social media and, TikTok and all these things. So the voices appear to be louder now than when I was born, only because they're everywhere now, right? So the current debate, and what has really always been the debate, really boils down to one simple question: where do you think life begins? And so in the states like Alabama, where they believe that life begins at fertilization, so that moment when the sperm and the egg come together in the petri dish, if you believe that, then you can imagine like what happens if that embryo that's created then gets discarded or gets frozen. Like, is that considered, harming a person? Because they have something on their books called like a personhood law, saying like embryos equal children. I obviously stand firmly on the side of things that, like, my doctors always told me that an embryo is not truly viable to survive on its own, like in a petri dish or whatever, until it's put back in a mother's womb. And so if you believe that, then, all these things that we have to do that are part of a necessary IVF process, make sense, where we can freeze embryos and it's fine. And, there's no legal repercussions to that kind of thing. So that's really what the whole debate is. And because Alabama ruled embryos equal people, all of these clinics got really skittish and said, well, wait a minute. Does that mean like if our patients decide to change clinics and go to a different state where IVF is outlawed, is that considered human trafficking? Are we liable? Are there legal ramifications to these decisions and verbiage in state constitutions and things that makes patients' lives very complicated. And unfortunately, it varies state to state right now. So that's why I've been working really hard, and why I was invited to the State of the Union, to, help educate about all these issues and how these legal phrases really impact patient care. Because effectively what happened when Alabama said embryos equal people, they didn't say IVF is stopped in this state, but they didn't have to, because it made clinics nervous enough that clinics stopped the procedures themselves. So now you imagine these women going through who are like ready to have their transfers, on Friday, and everything was put to a halt on a Thursday. And you've spent thousands and thousands of dollars because, spoiler alert, Alabama is a state without insurance coverage, right? So now you're exacerbating the problem of how long it takes to have a baby using IVF and the cost associated with it. And It was just crazy to watch.
Other questions?
Elizabeth, it's quite interesting. This is Roger. My daughter tried to have children and was unable to. And they did some testing and, surgery reviews. And
Yep.
they found out she had 2 uteruses.
Yep.
Now, I don't know, would IVF work in that kind of condition?
So she'd have to talk to her doctor. But there have been cases where, yes, it can be successful. Through either you could have one of the uteruses surgically removed, or there have been some very rare cases, because it hasn't been, it's not that common. It does happen, but it's not a common case, that, they're born that way. But there have been successful pregnancies in cases like that because of IVF. Yeah, it's incredible. The other options, that's the other thing. IVF opened the door to not just, being able to have your own child because of your own medical conditions, but it opened the door to allowing surrogacy to happen, right? Like a sperm and an egg from her and her partner or whatever, and then having a gestational carrier where they actually would bring the birth to term, but it's all linked DNA wise to, your daughter and her partner, which is, I think, just a testament to all the technology that's available now. It's incredible what's possible.
Yeah. I assume it's pretty much accepted countrywide anyway. 12 million children.
Yeah, well, yes, it is. And what's mind-boggling is, like, this is an issue that, you may not be familiar with the stat, but 1 in 6 people experiences infertility. So you either are experiencing it yourself or someone in your immediate circle who is. I mean, that's a crazy statistic.
Yes, it is.
So yeah, I mean, it's just to think about all the people who are here now because of this technology. It really is quite humbling to think about.
Interesting. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, and as you mentioned that stat, yeah, I think it's good to remember that there is a lot of shame around infertility, or feelings of not being who we're expected to be, or being able to kind of live out our dreams. How can we best support as individuals, either on normalizing IVF? The 12 million stat is incredibly helpful. And how can, I won't even say we, how can I help advocate for, I don't know, the right moves? I don't even know what those are. Like, what end do we want to come to?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the biggest thing is, even if you don't need to access these technologies yourself, you can position yourself as an ally to using those technologies, and you can do it in a bunch of different ways. The first way is, maybe you didn't go through fertility treatments yourself, but even just sharing, like you heard from me today, and sharing who I am, and a little bit about, what I had to say, with anybody you talk to, and say, gee, it was interesting. I hope it was interesting. What she had to say the other day. Because I think a lot of people think that we, just aren't supposed to talk about these issues. And then anytime there's a story or an article about these issues, I mean, you can, because it's part of my day job, I have a Google alert set up for the phrase IVF. And I get several hundred emails a day based off of that Google alert, because there are constantly stories about these technologies. So even just sharing something that you may see in the news about, like, the struggle to build a family. And then the other thing I will say is Resolve, which is the National Infertility Awareness Organization, is an incredibly helpful resource, not just for people experiencing infertility or trying to build their families, but also from an educational standpoint, as well as legislatively. You can find out, they have a map of exactly what's going on in your particular state. There is actually a scorecard on their website, which will show you how Indy racks up against the rest of the country in terms of insurance coverage and things like that. And you can sign up for the Resolve Advocacy Network. So what that does is tells you anytime there's any action going on in your state that they could use your help with, that you'll get a notification or a text message or an email, which is just incredible. Yeah, this is Resolve's website. And if you go up to the Take Action button there, you'll see all of their different issues and where they stand and how they operate. And again, under Learn, there's all kinds of information. That's where I usually point people, because their Fertility 101 is really helpful. Just in terms of like explaining all the things out there other than IVF, because as I said, there are so many options now that it's almost overwhelming. So they're a great first stop.
I think, well, Trina has a question, and I think a lot of us probably would like the answer to this, and it's a little off, but what was it like being at the State of the Union?
Oh man. You know, my husband and I were just talking about this for an upcoming podcast that I have next week. You know, here I am, I'm just doing my normal everyday life. And I get an email from Tim Kaine, who's one of the senators from Virginia, Tim Kaine's team, saying, we know IVF's in the news right now. We'd like to talk to you just to learn more. Okay, great. So I talked to them. And at the end of the phone call, they say, by the way, we're going to put you on the short list for attending the State of the Union as Tim's guest. Would you be up for that? Well, of course I'd be up for that. But I thought, well, I'm on a long list. Like, there's no way they're going to pick me, like, whatever. And then a day and a half later, they were like, okay, we need, you know, all kinds of personal information so we can get a security clearance for you and a hotel room booked and, you know, whatever. So it was pretty surreal to attend the State of the Union. I will say the security, if you haven't been there, I can't even describe the level of security. And everybody's like, why don't you have pictures? Well, because they confiscate your cell phones and my purse, like everything. They take all of your personal belongings so that you go into the room and all that you have is your little ticket to get into the room. And then you sit there and you don't get to leave until the president does. So there's no opportunity for like taking selfies in the gallery or anything like that. So it was a really incredible experience. But I think even more fun than that people don't realize is I get to have dinner with all of the senators before the State of the Union in the senatorial dining room, which typically only senators are allowed in this dining room, except for the night of the State of the Union, which is pretty incredible. So it was a really special occasion, and so many people came up and gave me hugs and thanked me for being there and, you know, talking about these issues. It was pretty awesome. So yeah. And TK, I call him TK now because we're besties, and he's incredible and I just adore him. I think he's a lovely human being. He's done a lot for the state of Virginia. So fun times.
Greg, you're on mute. Greg, you're on mute. Anyone else have questions? Let me send him a message.
Am I there now?
Now
Yes.
you are.
There you go.
All right, my question is this becoming less of a political issue this year or more? In other words, are you having some conversations with Republicans that might tell you something off the record that they won't tell you in public? That was what my experience in the Senate, working in the Senate, was that so much agreement was there, but they would never say things publicly. Have you noticed that?
Yeah, so it's definitely a hot button political issue this year for sure. And I think the tough thing is, yeah, getting this bipartisan support, because on the record, people say they're for IVF, but then their actions do not line up with protecting the ability to actually access those technologies. So a lot of I call it my second day job, is spent on the phones and having video calls with, you know, members of the Republican Party talking about these issues. I mean, even right here in Massachusetts, we had Governor Mitt Romney, who is, you know, obviously, everybody knows who he is, and he's an IVF granddad. So we really need the people in the Republican Party that have been impacted by infertility directly to help us spread the word about why these technologies are so important, right? Like, why would he not want his grandkids to be here? He wants his grandkids to be here. And he, you know, so if that technology doesn't exist, his grandkids don't exist either. So that's 99% of my other job
Okay.
is having those conversations. Yeah.
Or you can, so thank you very much.
Yeah, of course.
Can you tell us one of your many events you've gone to? Can you give us maybe one of the highlights and one of the bad days
I'm trying to think.
that really affected you?
Okay, so one of the highlights, I think when I was at the State of the Union and I was having dinner with all the senators beforehand, I had the pleasure of sitting next to Senator Tammy Duckworth, who has been an incredible advocate for IVF, and she was wounded in combat, and which is why she needed to have IVF to build her family. And she has 2 little children, and we were sitting there at dinner comparing notes about our kids. I have an almost 14-year-old son, and she just, you know, was so grateful that this technology existed and that my parents went through all they did to have me, that she was like, well, what can I do for you? And I didn't totally take the question seriously, because I responded with like, well, my son really wants to know if he's going to get bonus points for his civics class because mom's at the State of the Union. And so she just kind of chuckled. And then 2 minutes later, an aide is produced with paper and a pen. And she's very serious. And she looks at me and goes, now how do you spell your son's name? And she writes a handwritten, actually, I have it right here. A handwritten note to my son's civics teacher. There it is. And it says, to whom it may concern, please issue extra credit to Trevor Camo upon presentation of this note. And then 5 other senators signed the note.
Oh, that's awesome.
So that really touched me. And in terms of bad days, you know, there are still the people that I get the hate mail. I'm very public with my story. And so I get, you know, the hate mail and saying I shouldn't even be here and, you know, things like that. And my parents actually, when I was born, thankfully I was born in the 80s. So we had an unlisted phone number, which allowed us some modicum of privacy back then.
Right.
But my parents actually, you know, did get death threats and things in the mail. And we, for a long time, had unpublished addresses so that our mail would have to be screened first.
And this was after your birth?
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yep. So, and that still exists. It's just in a different form now. It's not mailed letters anymore. It's a lot of online hate. But it's not going to stop me. So it hasn't stopped me yet. So
It
One
sounds to
last
me
question
like,
by me.
go
When
ahead.
you had your babies, was it natural?
yep.
You went through the
I
full
had-
natural
I
process?
had no issues at all. I had my son when I was 28. And that was something they studied when I was younger. They weren't sure how, you know, being a product of this technology would impact my own fertility, but it didn't. And it doesn't. So yeah, all I had was he was 2 weeks overdue. That was my biggest problem.
I
So,
didn't know. I'd say you're a regular person and wonderful.
Exactly.
So,
I'm almost normal. I'm almost normal.
I say you are normal. Thank you.
So over time, I mean, the whole
Right.
concept is basically the same. Over time, they've improved. Do you take hormones? Do you not, et cetera.
Yep.
Is there any expansion of what they're going to do with IVF? Is there any room for expansion, or was that cause too much concern besides fertilizing all the eggs and putting them back in?
Yeah, so now it's not just IVF, the process of IVF itself, it's everything surrounding IVF that there are a lot more options. So for example, you can do genetic testing now when you never could, to test for disease. We didn't have that capability back in the 80s. Things like, even in places where there is or isn't insurance coverage, people are working really hard to bring the cost down, because it is astronomically expensive. An average IVF cycle cost is about $25,000, and there's no guarantee that it's going to work. It usually does. I'm very rare that it worked on the first try. For most people, it does not work on the first try. It works on the third, fourth, sixth, seventh try. So if you're imagining 25K times 6, it's a lot of money. People sell their houses to even access this technology, which is why insurance coverage is so critically important. And other countries have models that the US, aspires to, I think. Israel, for example, you're allowed 3 cycles of IVF fully paid for by the government, which is quite incredible. Other places like England, there's what they call a postcode lottery. So depending on where you live, you enter a lottery, and if your number's called, you get X amount of money off, or you get a free cycle, which is quite impressive as well. So there's a lot of different models out there. I think the US just, because we haven't cracked the nut of having universal insurance coverage for these things, and it just varies state by state, it's made it much more difficult for us to navigate, because in addition, it depends on what the insurance companies will or won't reimburse. So, for example, in Massachusetts, I told you insurance coverage is mandated. However, that only means the procedure of IVF. It does not include any of the drugs, which is at least 5 to 10K out of pocket. So there are still there's still a lot of work to do.
Doesn't, hello, this is Mr. Silver again. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
What about talking to Senator Duckworth about adding that to the, to a bill that would, that President's talking about, and the successor president, at least one of them,
Yeah.
candidate is talking about, increasing the coverage of insurance for everyone. And that would be something, maybe they could negotiate that, with the, I don't know whether Medicare doesn't come into play, but whether they can negotiate that down so that your opportunity is there for others.
Yeah, so we actually just had a bill where we proposed this very thing, and it failed. It did not make it past the Senate floor. Now we're not giving up, and actually our tactic in years past has been to start with the largest employer in the country, which happens to be the federal government. And IVF
Sure.
is still not covered for federal employees. So
Well,
that
there's an opportunity. Mhm.
that has been a big, big focus of starting with the largest employer in the country, which is the federal government, to cover access to these reproductive technologies. And as soon as we can get that done, I think it'll make the rest of everything we're trying to do much smoother. So we've gotten really, really close. And now we've gotten it so that some of the technologies are covered. But now we're at the point where IVF is covered, but only if you can prove that your infertility was caused through a deployment. So we're taking baby steps. We're incrementally getting there. And this is kind of how it seems like every time we get a little further, we have to inch, a little further down the goal line. So
It kind of takes the words pro-life and some upside down, doesn't it? In some ways. Yeah, you can use those. Of course you can. I know where you're at. Thank you.
Other questions? Elizabeth, it was just a delight to meet you and have you speak to us today. It was a very interesting and informative talk that you gave to us, and we're going to donate in your honor to Changing Footprints. They collect, sort, and redistribute unused shoes each year for those in our local community across the United States and in 21 countries. We thank you so much. You're so energetic and bubbly. We know every day is going to be a good day for you just because you smile a lot. So thank you for being here with us. All right, folks, it's time for the stupid dad joke. Here you go. Ready?
Thank you, Elizabeth.
Hear the rumor about butter? Well, I'm not going to spread it. Ha ha ha.
Okay,
Okay.
Mary,
So
Mary,
thank you very much. Yes, Greg.
Mary, you
Yes.
have, I wanted to say that Elizabeth is a example of life itself. And we should be real proud that she's been with us today and proud of what she's done in her life. And it's a great legacy that you have, Elizabeth, and I hope you'll take it forward. I know you have the ability to do that. I know you're already thinking about that. So thank you. And Mary, I was online. I was not online because I'm in a wilderness area in southern
Well,
Indiana.
I
But,
said your poem, but it wasn't nearly as eloquent as you
Well,
do, Greg. So
the cardinal is singing for Elizabeth today. Okay,
that's
thank
right.
you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
I gotta ask Greg, did you have